My name is Juliet. I'm a software engineer, though that title has never meant much to my family. To them, I was always the one who wandered too far, stayed too quiet, and never quite lived up to the blueprint they imagined. Last week, I got a call from my mother. She said they were having a small family dinner to celebrate my brother David's latest milestone. She didn't say what it was, but I knew. David's always achieving something. I hadn't been home in almost 3 years. The last time I sat at that table, David was being toasted for a promotion, and I was being asked if I was still fixing printers or doing freelance websites. I remember nodding and smiling while someone passed me the salad like I wasn't slowly choking on the space between who I was and who they thought I'd become. Tomorrow morning, I'll be sitting across from David again, but this time it won't be in our parents' dining room. It'll be in a boardroom under fluorescent lights across polished glass. I'll be introduced as the interim CTO brought in by the firm's investors to restructure the company's crumbling tech stack. David won't know until he sees me, but tonight I'll sit at the same table as always, in the same seat, listening to the same conversations about quarterly bonuses and family pride. I'll answer questions vaguely. I'll smile politely when someone mentions how hard it must be to find stability in the tech world. I won't correct them, because tomorrow doesn't need explaining. It will speak for itself. I parked across the street from my parents' house and sat in the car for a minute, watching the porch light flicker through the windshield. The house looked exactly the same. The paint on the garage door was peeling, and the rose bushes out front were trimmed too short, like someone had given up halfway. Inside, I knew there would be a framed photo of David shaking hands with a CEO, and next to it, a space on the wall where my graduation portrait used to hang. I wasn't angry. I was just tired of trying. I stepped out of the car, adjusted the cuff of my coat, and walked toward the front door. The air smelled like rain and old memory. I rang the bell. I was ready. David was always the one they talked about. At every dinner, every holiday, every school event, the focus settled on him like sunlight through a magnifying glass. He was the straight-A student, the varsity athlete, the future CEO before he even finished high school. I was the quiet one. I liked books, puzzles, and computers. I spent hours in the garage pulling apart old keyboards, teaching myself how to write simple code on a borrowed laptop. When I tried to show them, they smiled like I'd drawn something cute on the fridge. At school, I did well. I made the honor roll every semester. I got into the AP math class a year early. I built a mobile app at 15 that helped students organize homework assignments. My teacher called it impressive. My dad called it a nice hobby. They didn't mean to ignore me, not really. But every time they asked about David's grades and then turned to me with a vague, "How's everything?" I felt it. Every time they skipped over my awards in conversation or forgot I had a science fair, I felt it. The worst part was I started to believe it. Maybe it was just average, that maybe all my effort didn't really count unless someone important said it did. I remember getting a letter from MIT. I opened it alone in my room. When I told my parents, my mom paused halfway through folding towels and said that it was nice, but had I considered something more practical, like finance? David, on the other hand, never had to prove anything twice. When he said he wanted to major in business, they nodded proudly. When I said I wanted to major in computer science, they asked if I was sure I wanted to be stuck behind a screen all day. Still, I kept going. I graduated near the top of my class. I landed internships that were hard to get. I taught myself new languages late at night while they watched TV in the next room. I didn't do it for their praise. I did it because it mattered to me. But a part of me always hoped they'd notice. Our family dinners had the same rhythm every time. My dad would ask about David's goals. My mom would chime in about how he was going to make partner before 30. Then someone would glance at me and ask if I was still playing around with those tech startups. I always smiled and said yes. I learned early that silence was safer than trying to explain. If I said too much, they'd either misunderstand or dismiss it. If I said too little, at least I could keep my dignity. Over time, I just stopped offering anything at all. Looking back now, I don't think they meant to make me feel small. They just didn't know how to see someone who didn't follow their path. They thought success looked one way, and since I didn't fit the mold, I must be lost. But I wasn't lost. I was building something. Quietly, patiently, without permission, and one day that would be enough. I left home the summer after graduation with 2 suitcases, a second-hand laptop, and a job offer that barely paid enough for rent. It was a support role at a tiny startup, the kind of place where everyone did everything and nothing was certain for more than a week. I answered tickets, reset passwords, and patched bugs at midnight just to keep the product online. There were moments I almost gave up. My apartment had paper-thin walls, and I lived off instant noodles and borrowed Wi-Fi when mine got cut. No one knew my name in meetings, but when something broke, they always called me. I kept learning. JavaScript, Python, cloud infrastructure, system design. I absorbed it all like oxygen. 3 years in, I was leading a small dev team. Not because someone handed it to me, but because when deadlines loomed, I showed up. I asked hard questions, rewrote bad code, and stayed calm when others panicked. I didn't brag. I just delivered. And slowly, people started to notice. I never posted promotions online. I didn't call home to tell them about the Series B round we closed or the patent I helped write. It wasn't out of bitterness. I just didn't need to anymore. There was power in becoming someone without waiting for permission. I knew I still wasn't what they imagined when they thought of success. But I had built something with my own hands, something real. At night, I'd sit on my fire escape with my laptop on my knees, coding by the light of the street lamp and the hum of passing traffic. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And that was the turning point. I stopped trying to be impressive. I started being undeniable. The offer came on a Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished presenting a systems audit for a logistics startup when my phone buzzed with a message from a partner at a tech-focused investment firm. They said they'd been following my work for a while and wanted to talk. We met later that week in a quiet corner booth downtown. They were rebuilding a product team at one of their portfolio companies. Too much technical debt, not enough execution. They needed someone who could step in fast, assess the mess, and reset the roadmap. Interim CTO. 3 months full authority. I didn't even ask which company. I said I'd think about it. But later that night, when the email came with the documentation, I froze. The name on the header was familiar. It was the same company my parents had been bragging about last Thanksgiving. The one David had just joined as product director. I read the first line of the company profile twice, then leaned back in my chair. Of all the companies they could have handed me, it had to be his. The one where his strategy had already started to fail, where the infrastructure couldn't keep up with scale, and where the board was finally paying attention. I didn't laugh. I didn't gloat. I read the architecture overview, opened my notepad, and started outlining the gaps. The opportunity wasn't personal, it was professional. But even so, a small part of me understood the symmetry. By the end of the week, I signed the contract. Full access, decision-making autonomy, start date Monday. I didn't tell anyone. Not my team, not my old boss, definitely not my family. The less noise, the better. I had a job to do. Still, I couldn't help thinking about the moment he'd see me walk into that boardroom. Not to ask for approval, not to explain, just to lead. The dining room looked just as I remembered. Polished oak table candlelight flickering off wine glasses, the smell of rosemary chicken drifting in from the kitchen. My mother moved briskly between dishes, asking David if he needed more water, complimenting the wine he had brought. My father sat at the head of the table, already halfway into a story about David's product rollout. He used phrases like leadership potential and market disruption with a kind of reverence, like quoting scripture. David nodded along, offering just enough humility to keep the praise flowing. I sat across from them listening, smiling when it felt expected, chewing slowly so I wouldn't have to speak. At one point, my mother turned to me and asked if I was still doing freelance tech work. She didn't wait for an answer before reaching for the breadbasket. My father followed with something about how it must be hard to find a steady footing in a volatile industry. I said it had its moments. David glanced at me curious for half a second, then turned back to his wine. He mentioned a new project at work, something to do with system integrations. I nearly laughed, but I didn't. I watched them as they spoke each sentence, building a wall around what they believed to be true. That David was on a clear path to success, that I was still drifting, that their assumptions were safe. I didn't correct them. Not when they said tech was unpredictable, not when my father mused about how David's team might be due for a shakeup. I let the words fall unnoticed like leaves on pavement. Because the truth wasn't for that table. It wasn't for that night. It was for the next morning in a room where decisions mattered. When dinner ended, my mother hugged me tightly and said she hoped I'd find something solid soon. I nodded. She meant well. In my old room, nothing had changed. Same faded comforter, same trophies on the shelf. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the ceiling. Tomorrow, I thought. Let them have tonight. Tomorrow is mine. The building looked different in daylight. Sleek glass panels reflected a sharp morning sun, and the lobby buzzed with the kind of corporate energy that smelled like ambition and overpriced coffee. I stepped out of the rideshare, adjusted my blazer, and walked through the front doors without hesitation. My badge was waiting at security, printed clean with my name and title, Interim CTO. I clipped it to my lapel and nodded at the guard who blinked twice before waving me through. As I walked across the marble floor, I felt the stares. Not rude, just confused. Curious. They weren't used to seeing someone like me walking in like I belonged, because most days people like me didn't. The elevator opened on the top floor. Executive wing. I knew the layout by heart. I had studied every inch of this company for weeks, from back-end vulnerabilities to org charts. Nothing about this was spontaneous. A woman from HR was waiting outside the boardroom, her expression flickering between surprise and realization. She reached out to shake my hand, said she hadn't expected me this early. I smiled. Early was the point. Inside the table was set for 12. The nameplate at the head of the table already had mine on it. Juliet Lynn, Interim CTO. I walked around the room, slowly letting the silence wrap around me like armor. One by one, the others began to arrive. Directors, engineers, investors. They nodded, offered greetings, and tried not to show their surprise. I answered every hello with calm clarity, took my seat, and opened my notebook. There was a moment of stillness before anyone sat down. The hierarchy had shifted, and everyone could feel it even if no one said it out loud. I wasn't just here to observe. I was here to lead. I didn't look for David. I didn't check to see if he was coming. I already knew he'd walk through that door. And when he did, everything would change. But for now, I sat tall at the head of the table and waited. This moment belonged to me. The meeting opened with a few pleasantries, a quick review of the agenda, and then the floor was mine. I stood clicked to the first slide and began walking through the room, through their own architecture. I didn't waste time on introductions. Titles were already printed on the folder in front of each seat. My tone was steady. My pacing is deliberate. I outlined performance gaps, failure points, and missing redundancies with the calm precision of someone who had lived inside complex systems for years. No one interrupted. By the third slide, the room had shifted. What began as polite attention turned into real focus. Heads tilted. Pens moved. Questions formed behind furrowed brows. They didn't expect me to know this much. I looked up and met David's eyes for the first time when I referenced the Phase 2 rollout strategy. His expression gave nothing away, but his posture changed. He leaned forward, hands tight around his pen. I asked a question about latency thresholds in their data pipeline. There was a pause. Then David cleared his throat and said he'd need to revisit that portion. I nodded. Told him it would need a revision before Thursday. No anger, no embarrassment, just protocol. The CTO before me had left behind layers of rushed decisions. I addressed each not with blame, but with clarity. This wasn't about pointing fingers. It was about building something that wouldn't break. By the end of the hour, the board wasn't just listening. They were asking for guidance. I responded with specifics. Clear benchmarks. Action steps. Metrics I expected to see. David remained quiet for the rest of the meeting. Not hostile, just unsettled. He saw what they saw now. Not a sister who dabbled in tech, but a leader with real authority. When it ended, the CEO thanked me for my direction and asked me to stay on site for further consultations. Everyone nodded. No one questioned the request. I gathered my notes, stood slowly, and left the room the same way I'd entered. Straight-backed. Certain. Not looking over my shoulder. I didn't need to. The room already knew who I was. My father was already waiting in the hallway when I stepped out of the boardroom. He looked like a man who had just walked into a room expecting applause and found a verdict instead. My mother stood beside him, clutching her bag with both hands. David leaned against the far wall, arms folded, eyes fixed on the floor. We were led into a small conference room. Quiet. Neutral. The kind of space designed for difficult conversations. I didn't sit. Neither did they. My father spoke first. He asked how long I'd been in this role. 6 months, I said. He repeated it softly like it didn't make sense. My mother looked up and asked why I hadn't told them. I told her I had. I sent updates, emails, even an invitation to my promotion ceremony. No one ever responded. She blinked, confused, then said they didn't understand what those things meant. I nodded. That was the problem. You never tried to. David finally looked up. He said he didn't know I was doing all this. He always thought I was just moving from project to project. I asked if he had ever thought to ask. He didn't answer. My father cleared his throat and said it wasn't personal. They just assumed I had chosen a different path, one less serious. I told him that choosing a different path didn't make it less. There was a long pause. Then my mother whispered that they should have come to my graduation, that they should have asked more questions. I nodded again. I wasn't angry. I had let go of that years ago. But I was done shrinking to fit their expectations. I told them I never needed praise, just respect. Just to be seen clearly, not through the lens of who they hoped I'd be. David stepped forward and said my feedback in the meeting had been fair, direct, but fair. He said it was impressive. I thanked him. It was the first time he had said anything like that. My father looked at me and said he had misjudged everything, that he owed me more than an apology. Then without ceremony, he held out his hand. It wasn't forced, it wasn't dramatic, just steady. I took it, firm grip. No resentment, just a quiet shift. For the first time, they saw me not as someone who had disappointed them, but as someone who had quietly risen while no one was watching. And this time, they didn't look away. 6 months later, my apartment smelled like roasted garlic and fresh linen. The living room was lit with soft lamps, the kind that made everything feel warmer than it really was. I had set the table for 4, not fancy, just simple and clean, the way I liked things now. My mother arrived first, holding a pie tin wrapped in a dish towel. She said it was an apple, still my favorite, and she hoped she hadn't overbaked it. I told her it smelled perfect. She looked around, noticed how organized everything was, then smiled quietly without commenting. David came next, a bottle of wine in hand, and a lightness in his step that surprised me. He gave me a nod like we were finally in on the same truth. No tension. Just an unspoken respect. My father showed up last. He carried a thin, black frame under his arm and placed it on my bookshelf like it belonged there. It was a printed article from a tech journal with my photo in the center titled Reinventing Legacy Infrastructure. He didn't say anything at first, just tapped the glass and said he thought I might want a copy. Dinner was easy. Conversation moved without effort. No one dominated. No one competed. For the first time, we sounded like a family trying instead of assuming. After we cleared the dishes and poured coffee, my father raised his mug slightly and cleared his throat. He said tonight wasn't about catching up or making up for lost time. It was about acknowledging what was always there. Sometimes it takes a while to see someone clearly, but once you do, you never forget. He ended with a quiet toast. To Juliet, who didn't wait to be seen, who became extraordinary anyway. I felt my chest tighten, not from sadness, but from something more solid, something earned. I looked around the table and saw no pity, no regret, just people finally willing to meet me where I was instead of dragging me back to where they left me. That night, after they left, I stood by the window and watched the city breathe. My books were back on the shelves. My name was on the door. For years, I thought I needed their approval to be real. But the truth is, I had already arrived, long before they noticed, long before they clapped. And that was enough.